Our next presenter is Associate Professor Sood. Sood spent part of his training time here at Austin, involved in the transplant unit. He was head of hepatology at the Royal Melbourne Hospital for 9 years, and now heads the hepatology department at Northern Health. He is a clinician and researcher with over 100 publications to his name, so he's been very busy. He holds a keen interest in rare and immune-mediated liver diseases, which of course includes PSC. So Dr. Sood is often referred to when patients ask on our forums for good Melbourne hepatologists. So it's exciting to be able to hear from him today with some information around clinical trials, including one currently recruiting as well. So we'll pass over to Dr. Sood.
Thanks, Travis, for that very kind introduction and apparent Facebook group comments. And thanks for having us here. Thanks, Kerry and PSC Support. So I'm talking on PSC current upcoming clinical trials. And the first thing I did was have a look online, and I actually found that there's been some very good talks, including by our next speaker, on this similar topic. So there's a great repository of information on YouTube if you wish as well. But look, I thought I'd handle it in a bit of a roundabout way as well, and that's looking at clinical trials in general as well. Now, PSC, we know that disease-specific therapies are actually somewhat lacking, and so we are desperately in need for treatments directed towards PSC and the clinical outcomes that we worry about and have already kind of been mentioned today. And so PSC is often considered an orphan disease. Now, orphan and rare often get used interchangeably. Technically, there's a small difference in that. But basically, an orphan disease is not getting as much investigation, much clinical research as other diseases. And the benefits of being labelled an orphan disease is that there is an easier pathway for companies to actually get their medications and drugs approved. And that's both in the US and here. So here there's waived fees, in the US there's other tax credits and things like that, because it is expensive to research drugs full stop, but especially when you're dealing with a drug which perhaps doesn't have the prevalence of other, or aimed at a disease which is less common, the commercial realities for companies can be a bit variable. And so there are these incentives to try and get more research into orphan diseases and more drugs involved. Technically, a rare disease, the definition's actually changed. It used to be under 2,000 patients Australia-wide was the kind of definition, which is obviously a bit variable as time goes on and the population changes. Now it's under 5 in 10,000, which is the same as the European definition. The American definition is slightly different. And there is a greater kind of call to action occurring, not just in PSC, but in a lot of other diseases. This is from the MJA last year, and you can note there's a few prominent kind of pediatric specialists, and I highlighted a couple of conditions there. PSC is not on this list, but they're kind of cholestatic liver diseases, so similar sort of conditions such as PSC. And interestingly, both these are mentioning IBATs, which are becoming more proven in the disease, and I think Arvik's already mentioned, and we'll go into a little bit later as well. And research globally, there's also a bigger push. Again, PSC Support from the UK have Mission 2030, which is an ambitious challenge to try and get more funding for PSC research. And that is, it's made 780 or so thousand pounds, which is 780 £100,000, which is quite a significant amount of money. And it's showing that there is extra work going into this and an extra effort being applied where it can. If you look at clinical trials, one of Kate's presentations kind of looked at this as well previously, and you can see that there is an uptrend in research and PSC in general that is occurring, and there is more research occurring, and hopefully this will lead to better outcomes as we continue. I thought I'd divert into kind of how clinical trials and research progresses, because it isn't a fast process, it's a slow process, and there's a lot of steps involved. There's obviously the preclinical aspect of things where people have to assess, is there compounds in the lab sort of stuff. Then you get phase 1, which is usually about safety more than anything. So a phase 1 study. Then you go towards phase 2 studies where, you're trying to find what, whether it does work at all clinically, and also the dosing that might be required. And then you get into phase 3 studies where you're usually exploring the drug in comparison with the best active therapies. only after that kind of process, and sometimes more at the phase 2 stage, but the drugs kind of get sent into the FDA, which is the American agency, for review. And if they review it and approve it, then it kind of moves on. And there's always post-clinical evaluation of the drug, which is the kind of phase 4 studies. And, in Australia, there's also extra delay between any time that the FDA and the US approves a drug, and there's usually at least a year or so before the drug's brought out here with a sponsor, sometimes longer, sometimes not at all. So it does also depend on the kind of commercial situation of the sponsor whose drug it is. And even after the TGA approves the medication, to get it approved on the PBS and funded in Australia, which especially for these drugs, they're not going to come at a cheap price usually. And so it does need to be funded by the government. And to do that, it needs to go through the Pharmaceutical Benefit Advisory Committee to look at also not just whether the drug works, but also the cost and likely cost to the Commonwealth in general in terms of overall outlay of drug costs. There are particular issues with PSC clinical trials when you're dealing with a drug in a disease such as PSC, and it can compromise, I suppose, our ability in Australia sometimes to get some of these drug trials. And one of the big things is, are there enough patients? PSC is a diverse disease. Not everybody has itch. Not everybody has fatigue. Not everyone has IBD. Not everyone's going to develop scarring or cirrhosis. And because of the great variability, and patients are very different, it can also mean that finding the subgroup for a trial and knowing which drug might work better in certain subgroups, it can be very difficult. And therefore, you either need more patients or you need to isolate which kind of group you're looking at, and that's hard as well. Then there's the bigger question, which is, how do we know if the disease even works? And so like most clinical trials, it needs to be compared with something. And when we don't have an actual therapy approved and available in PSC, that's a placebo that's usually used. And so it can be an issue that a lot of patients dislike the idea of a placebo. And obviously, it's not a great feeling knowing that you're putting in the effort to be part of a trial and you might not be getting the active compound. But the reality is that without doing that, it's very difficult to prove that a medication actually does work and is effective, because there have been times throughout the past in history where we've used drugs and treatments that haven't been effective or potentially even dangerous when we shouldn't have had them approved in the first place. Also with that is difficulty in assessing outcomes. PSC is a disease that can, the outcomes occur over years and decades in a lot of patients. And so, from a clinical trial perspective, having an outcome that occurs maybe 10 or 20 years in the future is a very difficult thing, because by the time that process ends, the drug's kind of off patent, and for the company doing the drug, there's less incentive, and it might have already been superseded by then. So what do we use as the option? So we can either go with something like side effects or symptoms. So, as Arvik's mentioned, could it improve fatigue or itch? Or we look at surrogate markers that we're interested in. So, for example, from a hepatology perspective, we care about whether scarring's developed, whether the patients are getting cholangitis, whether there's cancer development, etc. These things that clinically are probably, our narrow-minded focus sometimes is on the clinical kind of outcomes. And because those occur over years or decades, it's very hard to find out, well, who's going to develop that and who's not. And so we sometimes use surrogate markers such as a blood test result, such as the alkaline phosphatase or ALP level. And the problem with that is that also relies on the FDA and TGA and other government bodies to accept that. If we show that we get an improvement in your liver function test, if we get an improvement in your ALP, that basically what we believe is going to happen is that you're going to get an improvement in scarring developing, in cirrhosis development, in the need to not, well, I suppose the ability to avoid something like a transplant. So from the funders' perspective, that's what they're interested in, but it's hard to have that as an outcome as such. And so we do try and use surrogates where possible, but that also needs acceptance from the research bodies or the pharmaceutical bodies. And because Australia is far away, there's always significant costs of doing clinical trials. But we do tend to do clinical trials quite well. We have strong regulatory focus. We have good legislation in place to do clinical trials, make sure we're doing it properly, we're doing it safely, and there's good, strong oversight throughout Australia, really, for clinical trials, which is why companies do still come here for clinical trials in a lot of diseases. because we do it well. The benefits for patients is obviously clear in that you might get access to a new therapy that could be years away from us actually being able to prescribe for you. There's also often free medical care, including sometimes care such as parking costs and things like this. And there's also potential for some open label studies. So if the drug does show efficacy and does show benefit, a lot of the trials do then try and add an open label period, which means that everyone on the trial might be able to access the drug for an extended period of time. So we basically get earlier access for a longer period. And of course, even if you personally don't get benefit, even if you are in the placebo arm for the drug trial, then there's still a chance that you're helping other people, helping other patients with PSC, and anything that can further our research and information about the disease is going to be a positive to everybody in the future, even if there's no direct benefit to you today. I thought I'd then move to kind of recent and upcoming trials, just to mention a few things. I didn't want to go too much because a lot of these are a fair way away from kind of clinical use or development. And the first one I thought I'd mention was the Primus study, which was a Gilead trial that I was involved with at Royal Melbourne. It was a phase 3 randomized controlled trial, and the primary endpoint was liver biopsy and improvement in fibrosis. And look, from a clinical perspective, this is a really strong, hard endpoint. It's really something that, from a hepatologist's view, is something we want to prevent. Australian sites were involved. Some patients out there might have been on the trial, but unfortunately, because of the hard endpoint, it also can be quite difficult to prove that the drug's actually working. Anecdotally, even though we didn't know whether patients were on drug or not, it seemed to be having a pretty good effect biochemically and in other ways. But unfortunately, after they looked at the kind of global study of the first 160 patients, which is a standard kind of thing to look at the study as it's going, they felt they weren't ever going to achieve the outcome that was part of the clinical trial, and so they had to stop the trial early. There's also been trials on a drug called Nor-Urso, which is a little bit slightly different to ursodeoxycholic acid, which a lot of patients might be on. And again, some of the earlier trials have shown some benefit from Nor-Urso in terms of reduction in alkaline phosphatase, the blood test result. And so there is further study ongoing, phase 3, that should be due for completion in theory next year. Elafibranor is a compound produced by a company called Ipsen. The value, I suppose, in looking at this drug briefly is that it is actually a drug that has been approved overseas for the treatment of primary biliary cholangitis, or PBC. And it is hopefully a drug that may come out here soon for the same condition in second-line therapy. PBC is not PSC, but they are kind of similar diseases, and we've often looked at similar drugs in both those conditions, as they are both have similarities. There is a phase 2 study underway globally. That study is called the Elmwood study in US, Canada, and a few other places. And I contacted the company, but there's no fixed timelines for the phase 3 study. The phase 2 study is still at least a year away from completion, if that, but they're waiting for results of that before they kind of proceed with a bigger phase 3 research study, but it might be something that comes out in due time. And then mentioning the upcoming PSC trial in Melbourne that Arvik has also briefly mentioned. Again, the IBAT inhibitors are a new class of medication. As you can see from that previous MJR article we mentioned, it's actually being used in a few other conditions. And I won't go through this completely again, but again, it's talking about the recycling of the bile acid circulation. The fact is that in the ileum, these bile acids get reabsorbed in most of us. And so it's this constant recycling mechanism. Only 4 or 5% kind of is excreted in your feces or stool. And so by blocking these IBATs, you actually prevent the reabsorption and allow more of it to be excreted. And the hope is that by doing that, you get other benefits to the liver, and especially itch. It's got some good data, for example, in Alagille syndrome, which again is a slightly different condition. But again, it's just showing that these drugs are coming. They're a new class that have shown significant promise in other conditions, and may well get approved, hopefully, in some of these other conditions. And there are compassionate access programs available even in Australia, not for PSC, but for, again, some of the other cholestatic liver diseases. We're getting some access to some of these drugs, and I've got a couple of patients on them as part of that. So the upcoming PSC trial is the VISTA study. It's a phase 2B study, so they're looking to actually definitively study the dose and make sure it works. It is Valoxabat, which is an IBAT inhibitor, and it's against placebo. The two sites in Melbourne are the Northern Hospital and the Austin Hospital. I believe there are sites in Royal Adelaide. Kate Lynch is the lead investigator there, and I believe also Queensland and New South Wales also potentially have a couple of sites. I did request some slides from the company, but unfortunately they weren't able to provide that, and so we just have the paragraph here, which is similar to what Arvik's been able to show you, which is that it's for age 18 or older, have a confirmed diagnosis of PSC, and probably most relevantly and importantly are impacted by cholestatic itch caused by PSC. And there's obviously a lot more study inclusions and exclusions. I believe our site initiation visit is probably within a few weeks. It's booked tentatively for a couple of weeks' time. And we'll have more information and be able to kind of start then. And I think the Austin's on a similar type of time frame from my understanding. I'm not sure about the interstate sites at this point. If you do require or are interested, I believe Kerry has been in contact with the company sponsor as well, and there is hope that they might have some further information that's available for the public. But otherwise, speak to your specialists and hopefully they can refer you if appropriate. And again, I suppose looking at what this study is actually investigating, or what their endpoint is, the main indication is going to be itch, and the main outcomes they're going to look for are improvement in itch. Now, if you think about some of the other studies, if you're looking at alkaline phosphatase, the blood test, is always uncertainty about kind of whether that translates to hard endpoints. But also when you're looking at scarring, it can be a difficult endpoint to prove as well. And so itch is a symptomatic endpoint, looking for, improvement in itch and itch scales. This is one example of a visual kind of analog scale, with obviously 10 being the absolute worst itch imaginable. And I suppose the point there is you do not need severe itch for this study. You do not even necessarily need moderate itch, although I'm not sure the exact wording, but you do need some itch most days is my understanding, and we'll have further information in a few weeks, but it does require itch as the primary inclusion for the trial. And I'd like to acknowledge both Kate and Natasha, who are my two predecessors in giving this talk on YouTube. Thanks.